Hi, I'm Greg Corombos. My guest at this time is Andrew C. McCarthy, former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York. He is the author most recently of Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency. And he is also a Fox News contributor and a contributing editor and columnist at National Review Online. We want to get his reaction to the articles of impeachment drafted against President Trump by House Democrats. Andy, a lot to go over. Thanks for being with us.
It's my pleasure, Greg, but you need to tell me up front, am I a witness or a lawyer here? Because after watching that farce yesterday, I need to know whether are you supposed to put me under oath? Am I being cross-examined? Am I supposed to disappear in the middle of the interview? I don't know quite what to do.
Well, like most people who have appeared before these hearings, I'm pretty sure you're not a fact witness. So let's go with legal advice.
But I've heard some stuff.
We've heard a lot in the last few weeks. But so two articles of impeachment: abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. We knew the abuse of power one was coming. That's essentially the argument they've been offering for a number of weeks now, that the president abused the powers of his office in order to get the government of Ukraine to at least announce, if not actually launch, an investigation into a political rival, namely Joe Biden, as a result of Hunter Biden's work with Burisma. And then there's the obstruction of Congress, which is in response to the Trump administration refusing to hand over quite a few documents. The argument, of course, there is that the president has challenged that in court, and that could be still adjudicated in court. But what do you make of the two articles we saw today?
Well, as you say, they're not unexpected. I wrote a column over the weekend in which I had to correct myself even as I was writing it, Greg, because what I described this as initially was a rush to judgment. And I realized when I thought about it that was not really accurate, because the judgment was rendered long, long ago. This has really been a rush of a process in order to catch up to a judgment that a lot of the self-described resistance made before Trump ever entered office in 2017. So I don't think it's a surprise. I think how thin it is telling. As you point out, obstruction of justice, abuse of power, we've had reason to know that was coming for a while now. We knew that when the law professors testified last week, and there was not articles of impeachment yet for them to analyze, it seemed to me that it was clear that the law professors were being used to kind of articulate this loosey-goosey abuse of power standard, which is hard to describe. But I think if you say, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton enough times, it has credence, I suppose. And the idea, I think, was that they were going to, having gotten the law professors on record, they were going to plead articles of impeachment cribbing from what the law professors said. But, the problem they have, of course, is twofold. One is they don't have a crime. You don't need a crime for impeachment, but it sure helps to have one. And secondly, abuse of power is a nebulous standard, and that matters because the framers were very concerned in writing even high crimes and misdemeanors, which at least was a term of art that had a meaning at the end of the 18th century. They landed on high crimes and misdemeanors because they considered maladministration, which is really the concept that you're trying to get at with impeachment, but they decided not to adopt it because they thought it was too nebulous and it would potentially sweep in too much minor misconduct, trivial behavior, and that it could be used in a factional or partisan way. So here we are, quarter of a millennium later, and I think Democrats are doing exactly what the framers foresaw would be problematic. They've adopted this very loose standard that could be applied to any future president, and the reason they have had to settle on it after groping for weeks through campaign finance possibility to extortion to quid pro quo, and then they left quid pro quo because it turned out that bribery poll tested better. This is where they ended up. And again, I think it's exactly the abuse that the framers were worried about.
Andy, you mentioned just a moment ago how quid pro quo, suddenly the talking point became bribery. We heard it from Pelosi all the way down to basically every member of the House Intelligence Committee on the Democratic side, yet ultimately no article of impeachment for bribery. I know from our previous conversations that you don't believe it's warranted, but why don't you think the Democrats went there?
No, I think precisely that reason, Greg. In fact, I was wrong in another related prediction I made on the air yesterday when we were covering this at Fox. I said that I thought that the Democrats would file 4 articles of impeachment, one, the obstruction that we have, but I thought that they would try to split this abuse of power into 3 different articles, and one of them would be centered around the idea of bribery. And I think the reason they opted against that and just sort of folded everything into one abuse article is to try to conceal to the extent you can how weak it is. You know, the bribery wasn't brought because it was so problematic, starting with the minor inconvenience that there was no bribe, you know, in the sense that the Ukrainians end up getting their defense aid. They don't have to promise an investigation of the Bidens. So Schiff in the Intelligence Committee phase kind of drifted away from the common sense idea of bribery to this technical statutory idea that you could have a corrupt demand. Because under the statute, you don't have to follow through with the actual bribe as long as there's a demand that's made. And I think, you know, they realize that maybe that's good enough for guilt of a technical felony under a statute that Congress passed like 175 years after the Constitution was adopted, but it wasn't the bribery that the framers had in mind, which really, in this context, involved the fear that the American presidency would be co-opted by a foreign power. So since they didn't have a bribery, you know, a good fact pattern for bribery, I think they kind of slid it into this concept of abuse of power with the caveat that because impeachment doesn't require a criminal offense, you don't have to prove up the elements of bribery in order, at least technically or conceivably, to say that you had an abuse of power that had the flavor of bribery. You know, again, I think you could play these kind of games, but it doesn't really conceal how weak the offense is.
So what's next here? It's Judiciary Committee, I assume, approves the articles of impeachment. Then we get to the floor debate and ultimately the vote on impeachment.
Yeah, you know, the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, Representative Collins, I think he's of Ohio, if I'm
Georgia,
right.
Georgia.
Okay, yeah, Georgia. He keeps saying that this is being driven by a calendar and a clock, and he's right about that. They are trying to get this done by next Friday, if they can, by next Sunday. And when I'm saying next, I'm talking about not this week, but next week. So no later than December 20th or December 22nd. And Greg, I think that's really telling and probably a point worth making. If they thought that this was helping them politically, like the country was really into this and getting an eye-opening account of, Trump's misdeeds and misconduct and impeachable behavior, there would be no incentive to stop. You would just continue with this. I mean, they are concerned, obviously, about the argument that the closer it gets to the election day in November, the more the argument resonates, why not let the voters decide rather than have the political class decide? I've always said in response to that if we had a real impeachable offense, like, say, Trump really was an agent of Russia, it wouldn't matter if we found that out with hard evidence 2 weeks before Election Day. If you had a real impeachable offense, people would look at that and say, we can't tolerate having this unfit person in the Oval Office for one more minute, and they, no matter where it was in the calendar, you'd impeach him. But because we have this offense, if you can call it that, that's so amorphous that they can't even settle on what to call it, and end up having to tuck it into this, this kind of elastic idea of abuse of power, I think that's a good indication that they're just not ringing people's chimes, and they basically want to get this over with as fast as they can and move on to other things.
Andrew C. McCarthy, former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York. The book is Ball of Collusion. He's also a Fox News contributor and a contributing editor and columnist at National Review. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.